All right, today I'm doing the valve cover gaskets on a 2005 Chevy Suburban with a 5.3. Not a terribly difficult job to do, but I wanted to walk you through it and just teach you a couple of things that you might want to look at before you attempt this job. Here's a new set. Comes with the O-rings for the bolts, grommets, and gaskets. Velcro part number VS50504R1. I'm gonna go ahead and start tearing this down, moving this out of the way and removing the cover so that we can get the wiring harness out of the way and get a little bit of room for the camera views in here. You don't have to remove this or this. I'm just gonna do that so that we can see what we're doing, and we'll get started. All right, on the driver's side, we want to start by just go ahead and remove all these wires out of the coils. And you can use a body removal tool to get these clips up out of the way, or a flathead screwdriver. Nope, sometimes they don't survive. So this wiring harness on top of this bridge right here is connected with a little loom. They're poked through there. You can usually pry these out with a flathead screwdriver or a body tool. This one didn't survive, so from now on I'm just going to go ahead and recommend that you unclip those when we come across those. But first thing you want to do here on the driver's side is just remove this main wiring harness. That's the connector for all of the coils. Make sure all of the spark plug wires are disconnected. And then these bolts here, the studs, there's 5 of them, one in the back. The one on the passenger side is more difficult, but there's 5 studs here. These 5 studs come out, and this entire bridge with all the coils comes right out. And then the valve cover bolts are directly underneath that. And those are 10 millimeters there. All right, now with the coils out of the way, we can see the extent of the oil leakage here. I want to go ahead and spray this off with some brake clean and clean up as much around the gasket as I can so that we don't contaminate down into the rockers. So kind of wipe all this off, get some of this rat turds out of the way, spray it all down. All right, once you got that all cleaned up, you're gonna need an 8 millimeter. Break these 4 bolts loose. So one thing I want to make a note of is, see how these bolts go down? So when we're putting these back in, we're gonna have to make sure that we center them up because they'll move a little bit and you're gonna have to find where the threading is. They have a shoulder on them. This sleeve here has a shoulder. So when you tighten these things down, they go home and they pretty much stop. And that's what compresses the gasket. So once you have an old gasket that's been compressed flat and is starting to leak through here, it's really difficult to just torque this down because it's not going to go down any further like on the old school rigs and compress the gasket anymore. So even if you do give it a quarter of a turn, it's really not going to do anything to help reseal it. So in this case, on this vehicle, you just want to go ahead and take it off and replace the gaskets. Now these gaskets don't really require any silicone. On some of the other ones, there's a break in the head or the timing cover up front here. These ones are pretty much solid on the head. So really don't need any silicone or anything, just need to clean that surface off well and make sure it's not pitted, and then go ahead and clean up the valve cover itself. So the rubber grommets on these bolts might be a little bit stiff, so you're going to need some kind of force here to knock them out. They might split in half too, so I just go ahead and use a 1/4 inch extension, run them in backwards and just knock them out with a hammer. And then getting these things off, just go ahead and cut them, slide them off, and then press the new ones on very carefully, especially when it's cold out here like this, so that we don't split them as we put them back on. But I'll go ahead and get this all cleaned up now, get this old gasket out of here, and We'll go ahead and move forward. All right, now that we have the valve cover cleaned off inside and out, we're gonna go ahead and get the valve cover gasket put on and work on these grommets on the bolts to hold it down. We might need to rock these around a little bit to get them to stick in there good. You can see right there, that's not seating properly. It's pinching on the edge a little bit. Hasn't quite made it in. They have a small lip around them here. Maybe shoot a little grease on there or something. Get them to seat in a little bit easier. So I'm gonna try some brake clean. Although it makes rubbers and some things expand, if we just use a tiny bit real quick, it should make it a little bit more lubricated, and that'll dry out so that we don't have excess grease or oil in our sealing area. Seated in there nicely, so I'll just go ahead and do that, and that'll dry off. So make sure your gasket's seated down properly all the way around, especially around here. And if you need to stretch this gasket at all, do so very carefully, because if you overstretch this gasket, it will not shrink back down to size. If it does, it will take quite a while for it to elasticate back down. So this looks good. We just want to double check it after we set it on there to make sure that it didn't roll an edge before we tighten it all the way down. I was talking about, this one's catching on the edge here. We want to go ahead and pull that bolt up all the way. Start it hand tight. Make sure it's catching, and then go along with the other three. And once you get all four of these bolts tightened down, hand tight, started, I'm going to center up this valve cover and just get these just snug. Just for the moment, make sure all four of them are snugged up. And you want to double check to make sure that none of these grommets here got damaged. It could happen, but mainly you want to get yourself a mirror and a flashlight and check the gasket around the edge of the valve cover and make sure that it didn't roll. You can see in there, you can see the blue gasket. You want to make sure that that's in place all the way around, and then you can go ahead and tighten it down the rest of the way. When you're tightening these bolts down, when they start to stop on you, don't force them down anymore, because there's that shoulder on there, and you want to make sure that you don't snap these bolts off, because that will create yourself a huge headache. So just make sure they stop down and then maybe give them a quarter of a turn, nothing more than that. It should just be a matter of putting the 5 bolts back in for the coil packs, 4 spark plug wires, and your main plug should be able to move on to the other side. Okay, now on the passenger side, it's pretty much the same as the driver's side as regarding the gasket and the grommets. There's a couple of things to note though. This heater hoses here are held down onto the stud with a nut. You don't want to move these heater hoses at all, especially back here. This plastic connector that goes to the rear heater core, these plastic connectors will snap even just moving it just a little bit. So try to avoid moving this part of the heater hose at all. So when you take this collar off for the heater hoses to connect to the valve cover, support the hoses well and just barely get them off. And try to get this thing out from underneath it as easy as you can. Now that they're floating there, be extremely careful about them, not to bump into them when you're working underneath here or anything. Get these bolts out. You have to be really careful. It's not a horrible thing to replace, but if we don't have to break it, we don't want to. The 10mm wrench is because the back bolt of the 5 on the bridge for the coils, you can't really get a socket onto. So we're gonna have to go underneath here. Okay, once you get that bolt out, it can disappear. And then these coils should come right out. And then there's one PCV line right here on the front by the oil filler neck. Just carefully weasel that off so it doesn't split. It's got a lot of gunk inside of it. Might be a good time to spray that tube out. And now that the valve covers are completely clean, we'll be able to see if there's any further leaks in the future, any different leaks, or if it didn't take and somehow it's leaking still. But everything should be good to go at this point. Well, thank you guys for tuning in, and be sure to like or subscribe or stay tuned for another video in the near future. Look at this guy, the #1 bullshit guy.
Yeah, buddy.